This is an audio review of Chapter 12, Symbolic Interactionism, from Theories of Social Behavior. Okay, so the chapter starts off talking about Herbert Blumer, who is the person who coined the term Symbolic Interactionism in 1937. So he was primarily inspired by George Herbert Mead, who we'll talk about quite a bit in this lecture. And he was also notably a member of the Chicago School, and that was the group that was at the forefront of developing a type of sociology that, through detailed empirical studies, explored how individuals understand and negotiate their everyday life. Right? I'm sure you've heard of symbolic interactionism at some point. You can't get to a theories of sociology class without having that at some point come up. So we understand in the most basic terms that symbolic interactionists are saying meaning is made through interactions. So moving on to Blumer's three premises. So basically, these are meaning, interaction, and interpretation. So first, human beings act towards things on the basis of the meanings that the things have for them. So, for instance, what is a chair? Right? The idea is meanings are not inherent, they're based on our actions towards them. So a chair can be a place to sit. It can be, if you don't have a step stool, something to stand on to reach something up high, right? Or, I don't know, if someone's trying to attack you, it could be something to throw at them, right? So basically, this argument from symbolic interactionists is that the meanings themselves are not inherent, but based on how we act towards something. So that's that first premise, is meaning. The second one is the meanings of things come from the social interactions that a person has with others. So meaning there isn't some baseline existing meaning, that meanings are created and negotiated and maintained through interactions with each other. And it's this interpretive process. That's the part of the third part of this, right? Is that a person, when they interact, those meanings are then handled and modified through their own interpretation as they try to understand the meanings and the situations that they're encountering. So interpretation involves constructing the meaning of objects or the meanings of someone else's actions. So this is carried out through a conversation of gestures involving significant symbols. So those are words and gestures whose meanings are shared by those engaged in interactions. And we know that beyond just language, sometimes nonverbal communication is very important for what kind of message we're sending, right? Like if I say, that's fine, right? If I'm like, yeah, that's fine. Just even the inflection in a person's voice can indicate a different kind of meaning, or, rolling your eyes or sighing or things like that can also communicate meanings as well. But you have to have that shared understanding so that you can then interpret what someone else's actions are as to what their meanings are. So, during this internal dialogue of interpretation, an individual takes the attitude of another person. And so they experience themselves as an object, meaning you basically kind of see yourself as outside of yourself. And you try to understand how that person sees you. And so this creates this concept of self-consciousness. So this is the ability to see ourselves as others do and anticipate responses to our behavior. And of course, that has a very profound impact on our social life. So the idea that what we think, okay, if I do this, this is how people will see it outside of my body. And this is how, they will react to that particular action or meaning. And so basically the argument for that is that without that self-consciousness that comes from that internal dialogue of interpretation, then we wouldn't have the possibility of joint action. Because joint action only comes about when you're able to really see yourself as how others see you. So to have self-consciousness, remember here it means an estimation of yourself, not the kind of negative self-evaluation we tend to think of when we think of self-consciousness, right? But even the modern sense of self-consciousness, the roots of it are there too. When we feel self-conscious in the modern sense, we're at odds with what, we feel people think about us or how people see us, right? We think of what we're going to do through this place. And as Mead would argue, that we have to understand the values and attitudes of other people in order to have that kind of self-evaluation. And so our actions are often motivated by the process of absorbing the societal values and then, of course, judging our actions as whether people would see them as positive or negative or favorable or not favorable. So again, Blumer's joint action is just saying without that process going on inside of our heads, where we really try to understand where other people are coming from, then we can't collaborate. We can't, what he said, quote, joint actions range from a simple collaboration of two individuals to a complex alignment of the acts of huge organizations or institutions. So basically, to align behaviors with other people, you have to construct a shared interpretation by becoming an object to yourself. And then that's going to help you understand the gestures and the meanings in those interactions. So this is a form of joint action. And basically the argument here from symbolic interaction is that those individual small-scale interactions are the building blocks of society. So also turning to the differences between symbolic interactionism and functionalism, to Blumer, functionalism presented social structure as a straitjacket that determines behavior of individuals and groups. So basically he's saying that actors are not vessels for mechanical expression in the same way that, just kind of like learning roles and norms and then you do them because they've always been done, or kind of in that argument. Instead, a big part of symbolic interactionism is seeing social life as a dynamic process through which people are interpreting the gestures of others and they're doing their own as well. And so at every moment, they're creating or recreating or challenging or changing, the patterns of behavior that form the basis of the social order of society. All right, moving on to some of the really important influences on Goffman, who's, the majority of the chapter focuses on Goffman, but there's so much behind his own dramaturgy approach that you have to understand really coming from George Herbert Mead and his understandings of self, and of course William Thomas's definition of the situation. So Goffman was heavily influenced by both of these people, and they both looked at the self and how we can understand the self in defining situations in which people mutually interact. So to really understand the self, the argument here is that the self is reflexive. It indicates that we can be both subject and object. So, sometimes you are experiencing things through the self, sometimes you're not, right? So let's say you're running, and you're just trying to get away from someone chasing you. You're not necessarily caught up in the moment of the self, right? You're not necessarily objectifying yourself and then trying to figure out how that person's interpreting you in that interaction, right? You're just doing something, you're caught up in the more physiological action of your body, right? So the self is basically split into subject and object, right? The person doing the action and really the way that we look at that action being done, right? The way that we're able to kind of understand it within the context of those interactions that they're having. So when understanding the two phases of the self, Mead was basically saying that the self consists of different phases, the I and the me. So the me is the immediate experience of the self that is able to maintain itself in the community, right? Me is that internal sense. And the I is the response of the individual to the attitude of the community as it appears in their own experience. So the I appears in our experience of memory only after we've acted to know what we've done and only after we've spoken to know what we've said. So the I is that object we create. It's the way that we can understand how other people would see us. I do this, I am this, right? But the me is really basically from the eyeballs outward as how you're in your body experiencing, reality. So the individual self, or who we think we are, is essentially a social construct or a product of interactions that are rooted in our perceptions of how other people will interpret and respond to our behaviors. Then, after we interact, how people react to those interactions informs our role-taking, and then, of course, how we continue to interact in the future. So again, even in this way, though, you have multiple selves because depending on the context of what you're in is what self you're going to be leaning into. So for instance, you might have a self that's for work, right? The one that's more polite and doesn't tell people what you really think, right? And then you have like yourself that is with friends, could be an example of that. So, we all have those multiple selves as we're basically constructing that object of ourselves to the context that we're in. So this is where interaction and the context within which it takes place determines who we are, the sort of self that appears, just as assuming the attitudes of a particular other shapes our behavior. The self you experience as a sibling is different from the one you experience as a coworker or a student, right? So again, interaction and context determines the self. Impression management, fascinating, refers to the verbal and nonverbal practices we employ in an attempt to present an acceptable image of ourselves to others. It's controlling what we say and do, and don't say and don't do, and how we do and don't do or don't say it, that speaks to taking the attitude of the other. So basically, we want people to see us in the best possible light. So I think in the modern context, Instagram's a good example of impression management and kind of extreme impression management. So in in-person, face-to-face communications or actions, people can do so much to try to present a favorable image of themselves. Maybe how they dress, how they walk, how they talk, how they compose themselves. But ultimately, you still actually interact in a face-to-face context. You see that person, right? Versus something like Instagram is a great example because you're really only interacting with people through the platform. And then through the platform, there's often this opportunity to use filters or edit your photos in ways that can portray a whole different extreme version of yourself that's not necessarily you, right? And again, through the idea of impression management, it just shows that people want to show the best version of themselves. So they have, all these annoying photos of their perfect brunches out with their friends. They have their, kind of constructed perfection of relationships or of, children. Oh, here's us all sitting together, being all loving. And it's funny if you've ever seen any of those posts that are like Instagram versus reality, where they get that one picture, but what comes before and after it is like parents screaming at their kids or just the struggle to actually get everyone to sit there and do that. Or if you've seen this out in person, right, where sometimes people are more obsessed with getting a photo of them looking happy doing the thing that they're doing rather than actually just enjoying the thing that they're doing, right? Or, because it's for the gram. It's an impression management technique. I'm taking this picture so people will think this particular thing about me or interact with me in a better way because look at me, I'm able to fulfill this particular norm or social value or whatever it is, right? So Instagram, again, is more extreme in impression management, largely because you're interacting through the platform and not like in a face-to-face manner. So you can literally edit all of the kind of reality out of life. So for instance, I remember there was a couple couples I was totally jealous of, and part of it was how impression management great they were when it comes to things like social media. Because nowadays we often interact with people more through that realm than through actually seeing them, even if they're family or friends. So sometimes, that becomes what you think their actual lives are. But they don't take pictures of them arguing or their kid throwing a tantrum or, they're not perfect parts of their vacation. They don't take pictures and express those things because they're just trying to impress you, to show the best part of themselves to others. So this is why I've been duped in the past into thinking certain relationships were very nice because I saw their impression management. And then they break up and you're like, oh, I can't believe that. And then you find out, oh, a lot of that was just staging to try to give off a favorable image. Okay, so moving on to the interaction order. While Mead contends that the central elements of social interaction are rooted in our imagination, Goffman looks to the scene within which individuals orient their actions to one another. So for Goffman, the essence of the self is found not in the interior cognitive deliberations of the individual, but rather in the interactions themselves. So the definition of the situation is a concept derived from another early contributor to the Chicago School of Sociology, William I. Thomas. So Thomas argued that, quote, preliminary to any self-determined act of behavior, there's always a stage of examination and deliberation, which we may call the definition of the situation, end quote. So basically, an individual's behavior or reaction to a situation is not automatic, but rather it's constructed on the basis of meanings that are attributed to the situation. In turn, those interested in understanding individuals and their behaviors must look at the subjective meanings that they attach to their actions. So Thomas points out that individuals do not create definitions of the situation, so much as they select them from pre-existing definitions when determining the meaning of any event or encounter. Thomas noted the link between meaning and action, saying, quote, "If men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences." So in other words, behavior is fundamentally shaped by or a consequence of the definition of the situation that's assigned by an individual. So Thomas contended that we act on the basis of meanings that we ascribe to situations or stimuli that we confront. So Thomas's dictum suggests that reality itself is created through the definition of the situation, because it lays the foundation on which individuals will interpret others and, of course, their own actions. So Goffman built upon all this, right? And really this notion of multiple selves, that when you know which self a person is supposed to present and how they present it, you know what to say and how to say it, what to do and how to do it. And then that's largely determined by defining what's going on in a situation. So we all encounter ambiguous situations and are unsure how to proceed. So for example, let's say you're walking down the street and you see a woman slap a man. How do you proceed? Well, it depends on your definition of the situation, right? How is it defined to you? There's a lot of ways you could read what's going on there, right? She could be abusive. Or maybe they're acting a scene in a film, right? There's cameras right off the side that you don't see. Or maybe she's trying to revive someone who's about to faint. How we interpret the ambiguous situation affects what we think is the best course of action. So we read others when we're unsure. So lastly, the dimensions of interaction. As a structural or collectivist component of encounters, definitions and the moral obligations attached to them both constrain and enable people in their self-presentation in particular ways. So Goffman studied the structural and moral ritual dimensions of interaction. He was mostly parting with symbolic interactionism and agreeing more with social anthropology, which we're going to cover in just a moment. Okay, that moment is up. Here we are. Social anthropology. Okay, so, Durkheim's study of tribal religions, we've already talked about this a little bit before, so we'll touch upon it just briefly again. Arguably, this had the most impact on Goffman's unique view of social interaction. So remember, Durkheim, he sought to uncover the origins of religion and demonstrate the inevitable presence of religion in all societies, including allegedly secular modern ones. Because remember, according to Durkheim, the worshipping of God is in fact a worshipping of society itself. While religious individuals experience and commune with a power greater than themselves, it's an external force that inspires awe and demands respect. The greater power is in fact society. It's not a supernatural deity in which we depend on for our well-being and from which we draw our strength, but rather society and the benefits that civilization provides. So kind of looking at this again, Durkheim looked at the importance of rituals and their capacity to bind participants to a common experience. And by unifying participants' focus through a shared practice, then those rituals are reaffirming society's collective conscience, or the totality of beliefs and sentiments that are commonly held in a society. And so this plays a central role in preserving social solidarity. Again, briefly, sacredness and the rituals of stability, right? So neither objects nor animals are intrinsically sacred, but every culture assigns to one or the other extraordinary qualities that set them apart from the everyday world of profane things. To those things that are sacred, that possess a moral authority or power, we yield unquestionably our own interests and our own desires. So rituals are really there to protect what is sacred, and in doing so to protect us. So Durkheim noted that as societies became larger and more complex, what was imbued with sacred qualities changed. Inhabitants of more traditional societies, again, were tied together by what we talked about before, mechanical solidarity, or feelings of oneness that come from having the same kind of system of beliefs and lifestyle. And as a result, the collective conscience is marked by shared beliefs and sentiments that encompass the individual's entire experience. So what is sacred, above all else, is the group. But in modern societies, they're populated by individuals who hold different occupations, who have different religious and political beliefs, and who affirm different ethnic and racial identities. So if specialization and cultivating individual differences marks modern societies, then that which is sacred has to take on a different character as well. Because obviously, you're not going to get the solidarity anymore in society that comes from being all the same. So it's the individual who is deemed sacred. For the individual alone is the common basis on which social solidarity can be maintained. Worshipping the group gets replaced by the cult of personality. It is to the interaction rituals that pervade everyday encounters, the ways that people, greet each other. As they said in the book, the ceremonial chain of hellos and excuse me's. This is the stuff that Goffman's interested in. Because it's through those acts of saying bless you when someone sneezes or things like that an individual affirms the sacred status of others while receiving his due in kind. So basically, looking at this through a social anthropology lens, you have someone like Warner that he's pulling ideas from that really adapted the study of tribal societies to the study of social class and ethnic stratification that was going on in urban society. So Warner argued that secular patriotic ceremonies serve not only to, reify that group solidarity, as Durkheim was saying, but also to reinforce a social class domination in society. So when you apply anthropology to urban society, Goffman followed Warner's lead here and tried to apply other insights and methods of anthropology to urban society. So defining interaction rituals as, quote, acts through whose symbolic component the actor shows how worthy he is of respect or how worthy he feels others are of it, end quote. Goffman's saying that there's a significance of seemingly insignificant acts. So something like demeanor and deference. A person's demeanor, like, how they act, their conduct, or their dress, right? And deference is something like how much honor or dignity or respect that is connected to a person. So basically that a demeanor symbolically accords to the deference that other people then give that person. So by expressing yourself as a well-demeanored or poorly demeaned person, an individual simultaneously bestows or withholds deference to others. The reciprocal nature of deference and demeanor is such that maintaining a well-demeaned image allows those to do likewise, as the deference they receive obligates them to confer proper deference in kind. So this connects back to class domination. So again, this idea that, someone says, oh, hello, and you're like, oh, hello back to you, right? Or, the excuse me and things like that. They're basically saying that this is also filtered through class domination, meaning people that are well-demeanored, as they put it, will get more deference, will get more dignity and respect. So basically, they will be treated better than others. And the idea of who has to kind of bow to them or say things to them changes. And if someone is, lower demeanor, a poorly demeaned is the way they put it, then someone can withhold deference to them and not be as kind to them. So avoidance rituals take the form of prescriptions, interdictions, and taboos, which imply acts the actor must refrain from doing, lest he violate the right of the recipient to keep him at a distance. Again, that's a direct quote. That's why it's wordy. So basically, an avoidance ritual grants an individual privacy necessary to conceal themselves from others, should they have a moment where they're not able to present themselves in a dignified way. And presentation rituals are, again, quote, acts through which the individual makes specific attestations to recipients concerning how he regards them and how he will treat them in the oncoming interaction, end quote. So we rely on avoidance and presentation rituals to steer our way through the potentially hazardous conditions that lurk beneath the surface of an encounter. And another part of this too is the symmetrical and asymmetrical rules. So symmetrical rules make up the collection of common courtesies that any well-demeaned person is obligated to perform and, of course, in return can expect to receive. Right? So, they say something polite, they get a response that's polite back, right? Asymmetrical rules require an individual to treat others differently from the way they are treated themselves. And these rules symbolically convey status differences that obtain between certain groupings with society. So think of asymmetrical rules like, different roles in society, like let's say a customer and a waiter, right? Oftentimes the waiter is going to be a lot more deferential, is going to offer more deference, more respect and dignity and honor to this person because of the asymmetrical relationship that they have there, where this person can either give them or withhold from them tips that are a central part of how they get paid, right? So, the idea that someone is like waiting on someone else, we have a very weird thing with this in our service economy. We basically like to pay in a retail sense for people to kind of serve us. This creates this asymmetrical power relationship that means that the person doing that has to be very nice, and the person that's receiving that action can be or doesn't really have to be in that same way, right? Because of the power differences between them. He's basically saying that all of our interactions with other people, it's like making a play and performing it on a stage. So Goffman introduced a vocabulary that was normally associated with words from the theater, like front, backstage, audience, setting, performance, and, performer and character. And so all of this is coming from the often unspoken and taken for granted subtleties that structure the interaction order. So first, you have stereotyped expectations of the front. The front is the part of the individual's performance which regularly functions in a general and fixed fashion to define the situation for those who observe the performance. Fronts tend to become institutionalized, as if performers conduct in similar settings by similar actors and thus give rise to stereotyped expectations that transcend and shape any particular presentation. So for instance, let's say the front of my performance as a professor, right, could be an example of that. So, I, talk to you about these concepts, I lecture about the topic that's kind of connected to the regular functions and the fixed fashion to kind of determine what is professor. Professor tells you about the concepts in a class or whatever, right? And the idea that it becomes institutionalized because people have similar performances in the similar context, right? So you've gone to school for many years and had many different kinds of teachers, and therefore that kind of role has become institutionalized by similar actors. And so that gives rise to those stereotyped expectations of, this is how a professor is supposed to act, or this is how a teacher is supposed to act, or this is what a lecture sounds like or looks like, right? That's going to kind of shape those expectations that you have from similar roles of people performing in similar ways in society. Okay, so then moving on to the setting and the personal front, Goffman is really just dividing the front into two parts. The setting consists of the scenery and the props that make up the physical space where a performance is conducted. It also entails a team in the form of the audience, as well as a team of conspiring individuals through their own activity collude with the actor so as to allow them to present an acceptable image. So the setting, but think of it again in the way of a play. It's basically like if you've ever seen a play, you know that they put in background settings to give you an idea of like where are you and what does that space mean. And going back to the symbolic interactionist argument is that, the setting, the definition of a situation matters. So the setting here is basically telling you what you should expect to happen within that space. So again, going back to the example as my role as professor, the setting being a classroom, or the setting being, Canvas, or, any other kind of like online platform that people, use for institutional education or whatever. That's going to have the kind of props and the scenery involved that's going to be appropriate to that performance of professor, right? So the props in this case could be like this PowerPoint or this lecture, or even like the tools I'm using to record this right now, the software I'm using, the microphone I'm using, the fact that I'm trying to block out the fact that my neighbor's kid has been screaming through this whole thing, right? I'll try and get that in editing, but I can't, I'm not a miracle worker. I mean, that kid is howling. But anyway, so, that could be the scenery and the props, right? Like being, in a classroom or having, an audio lecture through something like Canvas, again, conveys a certain expectation of the front of the setting in which a particular performance is taking place. And the personal front refers to items of expressive equipment that the audience identifies with the performer himself. So things like, the resources that make it possible for a person to carry themselves or appear before others in a particular light, right? So you're bringing in with yourself those stereotyped expectations of what that performance should be. And so that relationship between the team of, the performer and the audience, basically, the personal front is, again, how am I then connecting through that role with the expectations that you have with me as the audience? So the backstage is pretty interesting. This is the region of the performance that's normally unobserved by most people or restricted from the audience. The backstage is where impressions fostered by a performance is knowingly contradicted as a matter of course. So basically, how do I say that in words that make sense? It's basically like, where do you prepare for the front, right? The backstage. So think about it like if you're in a play, right? On the front stage where the setting is happening and all that's going on, there's a certain message being conveyed, right? There's a performance happening. But in the backstage, it's all the preparations that you didn't see go into that if you're a member of the audience, you don't know that. So again, going back to a role as professor as an example, my backstage could be making this thing or making the, lecture notes for this or reading the book or, getting a professional degree in sociology, you know what I mean? Those kind of things. The background work that I did or the years of teaching I've already done to prepare myself for this particular role at this particular time as professor, right? So the idea is that you don't want the audience to see the backstage. You want the front stage performance to seem almost kind of, magical without all that preparation that's going on backstage. But again, without that backstage preparation, the front stage performance would just not be possible. So as a character, the self is not an organic thing that has a specific location. The self is in reality an image, a managed impression that's fabricated in concert with others during an encounter. So Goffman also offers this different view when looking at a self as a performer. So he's suggesting that the individual does possess a self that's uniquely their own, and while we're presenting a contrived image to an audience in the front, in the backstage, we can relax. We can forego speaking our lines or step out of character. So the self as performer is more in keeping with our conventional understanding of selfhood, which maintains that being whatever part we might be playing or impression cast, there lies a thinking, feeling person behind that, a core being that is who we really are, and then there's who we're acting to be. So lastly, the self is an idea. In the front, you present to audiences what they know of you, and if you develop your sense of self through interactions with others, then is yourself not just really an image that's realized through performances with other people? So basically, in this argument, reality in truth is a fiction, right? Because it's really just a performance that we're performing for each other, and how we understand each other is through those performances. So, impression management, again, the fundamental dynamic underlying interaction, this is carried out according to any number of motives. We can be motivated by rational, calculating self-interest, such as, I'll be polite to this customer so they give me a bigger tip, right? Or it could be non-rational commitment to tradition or status requirements, like I'm respectful to this person because they have higher status, or I'm respectful to this person because it's tradition to honor my elders, or whatever it might be, right? Or this can happen through purposes of which we're not consciously aware, right? You can sometimes do those things because you don't even really know why you're doing them, right? Or why you're trying to impress people. So Goffman's explicit inclusion of both forms of motivating factors offers a more realistic portrayal of action. After all, behavior is rarely, if ever, motivated by a single consideration. It's often, overlapping stuff. Like maybe you're motivated by a rational self-interest to be polite to someone to get a tip, but also it's part of your commitment to tradition or status requirements, or, again, something you're not aware of, something you don't realize. So, while it's true that we have license to portray who we are to our own advantage, this holds only so long as we abide by the moral rules of interaction. Foremost among these rules is that we are who we claim to be. Because audiences are left to infer traits of the individual on the basis of the impressions we give out, they have little choice but to accept a performance on faith. Thus, impressions are treated as claims and promises that have implicitly been made, and claims and promises tend to have a moral character. So this connection between impression management and the moral standards to which it's subjected is captured in Goffman's notion of individuals as merchants of morality. So basically, his dialectical understanding not only of rational and non-rational motivating forces, but also that individualist and collectivist dimensions of social order. We present ourselves as well-demeanored persons, in part, because it's in our best interest to do so. Again, a rational motivation. But in doing so, we are also announcing our adherence to the moral standards that ritually organize social encounters. So our actions are not guided by a conscious effort to be morally upright or to ensure moral standards are being upheld. Rather, they're guided by an effort to present an image of ourselves. And it is that requires us to abide by the moral standards that shape interactions. So the interaction order is produced and reproduced through moral rules around which interaction itself is organized. Most of Goffman's central concepts are used to examine how individuals navigate their everyday lives. Okay, moving on to Hochschild. Okay, so she completed her master's and doctoral degrees at the University of California, Berkeley, at Cal, as we call it. While a student there, she became increasingly attuned to the struggles that women faced as they attempted to, basically be, successful in their careers, but also be considered successful in the role of female, which often includes caregiving expectations. So her research led her to the conclusion that sociology was patently male discipline, whose points of reference, theories, and methods were often derived from men's experiences, and therefore not fully encapsulating the human experience. So Hochschild is known for the sociology of emotions, which addresses not only the experiences of men, but also the experiences of women. The sociology of emotions informs the public not through objective statistical facts, but through stories of everyday life told by those who are living it. And so it seeks to explore not only what people think, but also how people feel. So the organismic model is derived from Darwin and Freud and William James. So she derived from Charles Darwin's writings because Darwin saw emotive gestures or emotional expressions such as anger or fear as largely universal, since all humans can be traced back to the same ancestral gene pool. So biology, not social factors, are said to shape emotions, and that accounts for why there's very little cross-cultural variation in the experience of emotions. So looking at emotions as instincts, right? They're viewed as instinctual or automatic responses to a stimulus that produces physiological changes. Our conscious awareness of such changes and the meanings we attribute to them are considered extrinsic to the emotions themselves. For example, the emotion we call fear is fundamentally a biologically driven response marked by increased heart rate, heightened adrenaline levels, and a constriction of our muscles. So fear is simply the label we use to describe the combination of these biological changes. So she used Freud's connection to instinctual drives and also, specifically connects, emotions to instinctions, meaning love, or namely eros, love or creation, and thanatos, or death and destruction. So when our ability to directly satisfy the demands of these two psychobiological instincts is hindered, this is when we can't get what we want or, do what we want to do. That's going to make us experience anxiety, which is the single most powerful emotion. Anxiety is an inescapable part of the human condition. It's tied to the necessary denial of instinctual gratification. In our attempt to avoid or minimize unpleasant or painful psychological distress, we develop defense mechanisms through which we unconsciously repress and redefine the real sources of our anxiety, the blocking of our instinctual drives. So Freud says that the experience of anxiety serves to alert the individual to impending dangers emanating either from their environment or from their own psychic state. So Hochschild extends his argument to all emotions, arguing that the entire range of emotive experiences, from joy to sadness to pride to shame, serve as signals through which we fit our prior expectations to our present situation. Okay, so looking at the interactional model, the individual is an active, conscious participant in the production and reproduction of social life. So this view informs Hochschild's own emotion management perspective, as emotions are seen as intimately connected to our conscious perceptions and interpretations of the situations in which we're involved. The active production of emotions is itself a social process, since the interpretation and labeling of feeling are based both on our reaction to the imagined responses of others, as well as to our awareness of the normative expectations that infuse a given situation. So emphasizing the social dimension of self-consciousness provides a vantage point for linking emotive experiences to cognitive processes and for recognizing the connections between the self and social control mechanisms. From this perspective, emotions can be understood as something other than irrational, displaced, or instinctual physiological responses to events. And recognizing that an individual's private emotions are produced and shaped within a public setting opens the door for examining how broader social structures can really affect people's emotive experiences. So when looking at Goffman and impression management, although Goffman did not explore explicitly the full range of emotions, his notion of impression management is also central to Hochschild's own emotion management model. So according to Hochschild, Goffman's singular focus on outward expression, or surface acting, leads to a blind spot in his analysis. So Goffman defines embarrassment as a feeling that arises when one or more actors are unable to fulfill the social expectations required to project an acceptable image of themselves to others. All of us have felt the sting of embarrassment. Goffman sees embarrassment for what it contributes to the flow of interaction. The point is not that Goffman ignores the play or the power of emotions, but rather his situationalism leads him to view emotions as something done to the actor, like embarrassment happens to him. But the essential features of emotions are not to be found in the mind or the body of the individual, as the organismic or the emotion management model contend, but rather in the ramifications for the encounter and for the actor's attempt to maintain a viable presentation of self. So, Hochschild builds a lot on emotion because emotion is a core sense of what she's arguing. So emotion is a biologically given sense. So again, borrowing from Darwin, she's really looking at it as something that's happening in our bodies, much like hearing or seeing or smelling, that communicates information from the world, to us. So emotions are fundamentally connected to biological processes. Unlike our other senses, though, emotions are also tied to behavior. They are experienced as the body physiologically readies itself to engage in action, especially social action. So emotions possess a cognitive component in the form of a signal function. So in this way, emotions are tied to our attempts to reconcile our expectations with the actuality of situations we find ourselves in. So emotions are created through emotion work. Hochschild maintains that emotions are actively produced and managed by individuals in the context of interactions. They're not simply experienced, they're created. So in an important sense, we do emotions in the form of emotion work. So emotion work refers to our efforts to alter the intensity or, manage the intensity or type of feelings that we're experiencing, right? So this can mean sometimes, for instance, eliciting or suppressing, right? So this could be, someone's a jerk to you and you're at work and you're like, have a great day, right? You suppress your emotion to be like, say what you're really thinking or curse them out, or something like that. And sometimes it's basically being happy when you're not, and other times it's, basically holding within emotions without expressing them. Like you're really upset, but you don't cry, right? That kind of thing would be like an emotion work, just because it's based on the expectations. Like think about that in relation to gender, right? That we really don't allow men to cry. So there's a lot more emotion work there when it comes to only expressing yourselves as outlets of like anger, frustration, but not through sadness or depression or things like that. So there's different types of emotion work as well. Cognitive emotion work is the attempt to change images, ideas, or thoughts in the services of changing the feelings associated with them. So bodily emotion work is really just trying to change the physical effects of an emotion. And expressive emotion work involves the attempt to alter the public display of emotional states. So emotion management focuses on deep acting, or like an inner process of trying to, basically determine what emotions we're having and how we're either suppressing or using them. So the fact that we try to shape our emotional experiences speaks to the power that the definition of the situation and feeling rules have to frame the situations that we're experiencing in our lives. So our feelings are managed by emotional labor. So again, deep acting here is often sold for a wage, right? So meaning we have a service economy that's founded on being caring and cheerful and suppressing your anger and boredom. Those are expectations when you're working. So emotional labor is a pervasive feature of modern society. It's required in an array of jobs that share three characteristics: face-to-face or voice-to-voice interaction with the public, a directive to produce specified emotional states in clients, and through training and supervision, employer control over workers' emotional activities. So from this description, it's easy to see that emotional labor is a pervasive feature in our service economy. But there's a cost to emotional labor. It often exacts a high cost from workers. So Hochschild here draws a parallel between the alienation experienced by factory workers and that experienced by those employed in the service industry. If a factory worker's body is bought and controlled by their employer, it's the service worker's feelings that are subjected to the dictates of another. Though manifested in different ways, both are detached or alienated from something that's vital to themselves. So this leads to this whole transmutation of emotional work. When our natural capacity to engage in emotion work is sold for a wage and bought to serve the profit motive, our feelings become a commodity engineered to further corporate or organizational interests. Right? Like, I don't know if any of you have worked at Disney. I know, a lot of people that have this idea that you always have to be smiling, right? Or even a notion that I'm sure we've all heard in any retail context is the customer is always right? This idea to your friendliness, your cheerfulness is not necessarily just to like benefit you financially. It's to benefit a corporation. It's to benefit, an organization itself, that they then get something from that particular experience. So this idea of it being transmuted, it just means it's going from a private act controlled by the individual to one that's publicly administered by a supervisor, such as in training manuals, like, hey, be nice to people. And in company policies, emotion work becomes a rationalized way to better serve instrumental purposes. So remember, Hochschild did a lot of this work within the airline industry, looking at what we now call flight attendants, but at the time was called stewardesses. And like looking at the ways in which that was codified into training manuals is pretty amazing, right? The idea that, you had to basically act like this person is a guest in your home is a flying tin can in the sky. And that, you're supposed to act like they're a guest, and so treat them with the kind of deference and respect that you would treat a guest in your own home. But it's not your home. It's a death trap in the sky, right? And basically, they had to do a lot of emotional labor to hide any of their own distress. I don't know if you've ever been on a plane and there starts to be turbulence. Who's the first person they look at? Right? They look at the flight attendant to be like, if they're losing their shit, we're all going to die, right? But if that person, basically, even if they know the plane's going down, they're taught through their instruction manuals to act as if everything is okay, to hopefully produce a false image of calm and really talk about emotional labor, having to pretend like, I'm okay, as it goes down, because that's kind of part of the job, right? And really, of course, Hochschild was looking at a time period where part of it was also like managing the emotion of like people sexually harassing you and that just being normal. I mean, they basically made it so like once you hit your mid-30s, you couldn't even be a stewardess, right? Because it was like, ew, oh, you're married, or oh, you're like in your mid-30s, you're old and gross. We don't want you to be a stewardess anymore. So obviously that's changed, and the way in which flight attendants work. Some of the conditions are different today, but actually, if you look at what Hochschild is arguing, it's actually kind of worse now, because planes nowadays, while again, don't get me wrong, not having to wear high heels for 12-hour flights is great. But, the fact that planes are getting smaller and smaller and more people are crammed into them, that's why they make them so damn small. So they didn't used to be that way. You used to have like thing called armrests, and it wasn't like in someone else's lap. And but these companies basically regulate themselves in a lot of ways. So they've been able to, over the years, squeeze more and more chairs in a plane. Why? So they can sell more seats and make more money. And at the same time, they've cut back on all those things they used to do, like giving out free food and drinks, which now you have to pay for. And also, like, there's a premium on some of these things, like, just a little pillow for your head. It's like, nope. Just the most simple things that used to be included are not, like food. And so if you think about it, what it is to be a flight attendant now is actually much harder to regulate that emotional labor, because the conditions on flights have gotten way worse. And so you see people like losing it on flights, like where they literally have to like duct tape people to their chair to get them to chill the hell out. And that's an interesting phenomenon in recent years. I think we've pushed planes to the breaking point as to how much a person's emotional labor can calm people down. There's just not enough of that to go around, right? Because the plane experience is just so much worse than it needs to be. Anyway, rant over. So basically, it's kind of important to understand like where she was developing this from as well, and into how she was looking at this playing out in specific workplace roles. So in looking at the commodification of feelings, the demands for emotion management are shaped by both social class and gender relations, such that middle-class workers and women are more susceptible to the commodification of their emotional or their emotive experiences. So, success within people's professions that are dominated by women often requires diligently controlling emotions in order to express the appropriate feeling state, such as being trustworthy, ambitious, caring, dedicated, whatever is associated with that occupation. Conversely, performance in male-dominated blue-collar jobs is graded more in terms of the quality of one's manual labor, more so than like how nice they were, right? So even who you are in that way is going to affect the kind of expectations of how you treat others and how you express your emotions within any role. Okay, moving on to Hochschild's theoretical orientation. So there's a non-rationalist dimension, and this is how emotion work is deep acting. So the concepts of emotion work and deep acting, again, connect. And they're rooted in individualist and non-rational presupposition. So Hochschild focuses on the efforts of individuals to shape their real feelings in the course of interacting with others. Certainly the well-being of both intimate and platonic relationships is dependent, at least in part, on individuals' commitment to engaging in emotion work. Right? Like, think about it. How good are your relationships going to be if you're always 100% on the surface with your emotions, out of pocket? It's going to be a problem. Okay, rationalist dimension is really looking at emotional labor. The surface acting requires the individual's managing of their outward appearance to present a convincing image of themselves. And the emphasis is less on emotions per se, and more on the actor's interest in maintaining an acceptable impression, which may involve faking feelings or suppressing feelings. So this rationalist dimension of action is carried one step further with the notion of emotional labor, in which an employee tries to evoke or suppress real emotions, not because they want to, but because they're being paid to do so. While the feelings experienced may be real, they're really manufactured as rational purposes, namely to keep their jobs. And then, of course, there's a collectivist and rational dimension in the commodification of feelings. Closely related to emotional labor is the concept of the commodification of feelings. The points of the collectivist, rational dimension, because there's this instrumental strategic stance towards emotion adopted through corporate designs or corporate expectations of how their workers should act or feel. So the notion of commodification of feelings turns our attention to the institutional or structural pressures that shape the individual's experience of emotions. And lastly, in a multidimensional approach, by looking at the concept of feeling rules, Hochschild's multiple dimension approach, again, is kind of comparing or combining the collectivist, non-rational dimensions of emotions. So feeling rules are shared social conventions that determine what we should feel in a given situation, how intensely we should feel it, and how long should we feel that, like the duration. And so this forms the take-it-for-granted notions that are the backdrop according to how we manage our emotions and assess the emotional expressions of others. So feeling rules account for the social patterning of emotional experiences, and in doing so establish the, quote, standards used in emotional conversation to determine what is rightly owed and owing in the currency of feeling, end quote. So this is basically, again, feeling rules is like what's acceptable in what space, right? So for an easy example of feeling rules is if you go to a funeral, there's certain feeling rules accepted, right? If you're like giggling a lot or you're taking selfies with like the corpse, that's not chill, right? That goes against the feeling rule expectations, right? But if you're there and you're somber and you're crying and you're pensive, you're basically, connecting your emotional experiences to that of grief or loss. That is according to the feeling rules that underlie our social patterns of a particular situation, right? If you're at a stand-up comedy show and you're laughing a lot, that makes sense. That goes along with the feeling rules of that space. It's a place to laugh. But if you're sobbing uncontrollably in that space or, experiencing grief-like symptoms there, that violates the feeling rules. So the idea is there's some collectivist notion, a societal notion of what rules you have as to what is a normal expression of emotion. And again, going back to what she says, it's specifically what we should feel in a situation. So the direction, how intensely we should feel it, right? So for instance, if you're at a funeral and it's someone that you're incredibly close to, you're very, have known them your whole life, then it makes sense that you're going to be more emotional than somebody who's like, oh, we were acquaintances, or, I used to walk his dog or something like that, then they shouldn't be like sobbing and holding onto the casket like, why, right? Because you're like, dude, you didn't even know him, right? So that's, how intensely we should feel something is kind of determined collectively. And again, how long should we feel it? So like, for how long is the grieving process appropriate? Well, it depends on who is the person we're grieving. If it's like your friend's cousin's mailman, grieving that for years could be problematic, right? That could be definitely not normal. Versus like if it's the loss of a parent or a spouse or a child or someone like very close to you, it makes sense that grieving process kind of lasts forever in a way. So, these things are basically taken for granted in the backdrop that inform how we understand how people act in a certain situation. So feeling rules are really embedded in the broader structural context of work, right? So they also connect back to social class and gender-based differences that determine what and how we're supposed to feel or how we should feel, right? And that's going to be governed by those different intersections of who we are. So just like behavioral standards, emotive standards are enforced through feeling rules. And so that means they're not the same for everyone. They're going to differ depending on those factors of who we are, right? Okay, well that wraps up the not so brief Chapter 12 audio lecture.